Testing. Testing. Hi, Julie. Testing. 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 Julie, can you hear me? Testing. 1, 2. Testing. 1, 2.
smokes, a little better. I thought she was going to be here. Whoever said she wasn't going to be here, but we're going to have to open the meeting anyway.
Yeah, I don't want this thing going.
It's not, hey, maybe it's not going to be a board vote. No board business.
It's 9:01.
No.
Doug, 9:01.
Okay. All right, I'd like to call the meeting to order.
That's how you do it.
Welcome everybody. Excuse me. Welcome everybody. This is a board work session to discuss the particulars about the reserve study. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn the meeting over to John Viola, who is our treasurer and the head of the Budget Finance Committee. John.
Okay, thank you, Doug. So everybody have a copy of the agenda. What we'll do is we'll start off with, I'm going to ask everybody to stand first for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. So we have a copy of the agenda. I'm just looking for approval of the agenda. Anybody on the board? Ted?
Move to approve the agenda.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you. Okay, so I just want to take a few minutes before we start just to talk about what we're doing today, why we're here, and what we look to accomplish today and what the scope is. So you've all heard about the reserve study. Today we're going to explain how the process works. We have Doug Green here from DMA who will take us through the process, will explain to us how they came up with the calculation. As far as detail that has gone into this study, probably 6 inches worth of detail, that has been vetted by the Budget and Finance Committee. We have worked on that the last 2 weeks. Can everybody hear me? The last 2 weeks, and that is not something for today's meeting. Otherwise, we'll never get finished within the 2 hours. But the B&F committee has their questions. They put them into JB on anything, and they're being vetted and as you know over these 2 weeks. So that's outside the scope for today on whether or not what we're doing on a country club or whatever. It's more about the process today, the explanation of how we came to the calculation at this point, and then for B&F to come back with a recommendation of what they believe the reserve should be at this period and how to approach it. Okay, anybody have any questions before we start? Okay. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand off to, well, he said do it after that, yeah. Actually, you know, I'm going to do it the way I wanted. So next I'm going to do the public comments before JB. That was actually the way I wanted to do it. So in any B&F meeting that we've had of this nature, B&F has opened it up to the audience to have comments, and it always has been done in an orderly fashion. So now's the time. I'd ask you to go up to the mic if anybody has any comments or questions for B&F before we start. I'll be glad to take them.
Just a quick question. Pete Gomsack. Will there be an opportunity for questions following, or is this the only period? Because the presentation will be given, I think, momentarily. Is this the only opportunity for questions from the public?
I'll answer it. I'm going to open it up at the end. After the presentation from Doug Green, I will open it up for questions in an orderly fashion.
Great, thank you.
Okay. With that, with no other comments, I'm going to ask JB for his introduction.
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest right after the discussion and interaction pieces that are on the agenda, that's where you put in the additional public comments after that.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll do.
All right. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. And we have the board and the Budget and Finance Committee, other interested parties, and most of all the department heads are here as well. And I've been pitching for this meeting for a long time and how important it is for everybody to grasp these concepts. What I will say before I turn it over to Doug Green is the fact that this is one major piece to what we do as an association. It helps understand everything about our replacement capital reserve for general things. We also have the bulkhead reserve and the road reserve. there are a couple things that are going to be talked about today, and that's new capital, and our operating budget, and strategic plan, capital plan, and survey. But all of those big 6 or 7 pieces factor into all of our financial piece for the association. So when we have we'll talk after we get, as we move towards the end of this, there's a place for action items and what next steps. And we'll talk about those when we get done with this main portion of what we're dealing with today with Doug Green. So with that, Doug Green from DMA Reserves, he is certified reserve advisor from the Community Association Institute, and he's been at this a while, so I will turn it over to him and he'll walk us through.
All right, thank you, JB. I'll try and speak loud so everybody can hear. If somebody can't hear, or something.
Give him a mic.
Speak loud.
Just leave them on. You don't have to put your right on.
Yeah, try to turn it on.
We've got it. We got it.
Yeah, the mic has to be on for it.
This is over here for member
If
comment
you don't
first, and
talk
now it
into
goes
the
to
mic,
Doug.
the people on TV can't hear you at all.
Speak right into it, though.
Right into it.
Yes, sir.
Turn them all
Yes,
on.
turn that on.
There may be times I have to type, in which case I would have to put this down, but we'll see how that works. I'm going to talk about the 3 reserve accounts that the Ocean Pines Association has. One is called the General Reserve Account, which is the largest and includes essentially all of the amenities and facilities that provide services to the community, to its members. It covers a broad spectrum of facilities and assets in the community. Quite a large number of assets, actually. The second reserve account is specifically focused on the bulkheads on the canals. There's a separate reserve account for those and a funding plan that is separate for those. And the third is what's called roads and bridges. As you may know, your roads essentially are private. There are funding sources from outside the community, which we'll talk about for that, but it is a separate reserve account from the general reserves account. My goal today is to explain how these work. We have gone over them a number of times. It might be that we go over them a little more, but at least at the staff level and at the board level. But we have gone through this quite extensively and repeatedly to ferret out issues, questions, and make sure that we have all the information included. So with that, I will say that what you're going to see on the screen today will vary a little bit from the draft that was sent to you folks, because we have done additional review and editing since that draft. And again, the goal of this process is, after this review, we can issue a final draft, essentially, of the report at this point. But when I say final draft, I will also emphasize that this system is set up to be an ongoing management tool. So it's not a one-time report. It's not a statement from God saying this is what you have to do and it'll never change. It can change. It's intended to change as new information becomes available. And obviously, what we're projecting here changes every day, because this community is a large facility. It's an ongoing process. They're doing work and replacement work and repair work all the time. And so it is intended that we can, let's say on an annual basis, update this study pretty easily with what actually has been happening in the community in the past year. That helps us use this to guide your planning for each subsequent budget year. I think in the past, Ocean Pines has kind of developed the reserve budget in the same way it's developed the operating budget. It's kind of looked at its asset list every year and developed a reserve plan for the coming year based on that. The intent of a reserve study is to project all of the long-term costs that are involved with these facilities and amenities, whether they be 1 year out, 5 years out, 30 years out, 40 years out. Look at what those costs are going to be, when they're likely to occur, and then develop a funding plan so that you will have the money to do those when you need to do it, and not have continual surprises of, oh, we didn't think about this, so now we have to come up with money for this item. That's the intent of the process. I'm going to, what's on the screen is a copy of the draft report, actually, that we sent you, and I'm just going to use that for a moment to talk about the organization of this particular report. And we are just going to talk about the general reserve account right now, and then when we're done with that, we'll then look at the bulkheads account and the roads account. I tend to do these things informally. We did call it a working session. I'm happy to take questions from this table as I go on. A lot of times what happens in that process is I get a question that is simply about something that I haven't gotten to yet, and I'll simply tell you that, and we'll get to it shortly. Okay, as we said, you have one general reserve account. In this report, you will see reference to several accounts called expenditure accounts for the administration building, the yacht club, the country club, beach club, swimming pools, parks and recreation, and public works. These are not separate accounts. They are simply for the purposes of organizing this study, separate accounts in the study. Otherwise, we would have very long spreadsheets with a whole lot of information. There's obviously the aggregate of all of these is a lot of components. And in order to kind of let it make sense, primarily to staff, as well as to board members and committee members, we break it down into these so that each separate, what I'm calling an expenditure account, will focus on one facility or a group of facilities. That way people who are responsible for those facilities can just focus on that and not have to weed through mountains of information that are irrelevant to them. So that's what, when we use the term expenditure accounts, that's what I'm talking about. That's just a feature of the reserve study itself. And go down through this. I'm not going to focus on these sheets except to say that in the report that you'll get, you will have a subtitle here, for example, reserve expenditure accounts for Ocean Pines Administration. As the picture shows, is the building across the parking lot and the things related to that, all those components. And I'm not expecting you to read this, I'm just showing you how the report's organized. But these are pages of components that are in that section, just related to that facility, okay? That is a database, and I'm going to explain how the database works in a minute. I'm going to pick one of these expenditure accounts and go through it on our actual spreadsheets. But that's a database of components. That database is then also presented in an annual list of expenditures for that facility, okay? It is a 30-year study, so this annual list of expenditures goes out 30 years. There's a group of components in each year. Obviously, like any kind of planning exercise, years 1 to 5, you can have a pretty good handle on what's going to happen. Years 25 to 30 are pretty speculative. But we have a forecasting tool. We're projecting estimated useful lives, and that's how we get things to show up in later years. The intent, again, is as years go on, that will be massaged, those projections will be adjusted. So keep in mind that this is a planning tool. It is not a prescriptive plan telling the association what to do when. It is looking at what the association is doing, planning to do, what we expect the life of things to be in the community, and therefore creating a funding plan and a logical approach to developing a funding budget for this. So that's what all these things do. And so we have this group, for example, for the administration, and then we go to other facilities such as the yacht club, which is shown here. With that, I'm going to go to an example. I'm going to go to the spreadsheets that are for the swimming pools, just to pick an example out. And what you're looking at here is our actual Excel spreadsheets. It's the actual calculating spreadsheets for the study. And I'm just going to explain, starting with what we call the schedule of components. And I'm going to explain what's in here and how this works.
Doug, do you have any idea what's the total number of components that you have?
You know, unfortunately, I thought about that question as I was driving over here, and I didn't have time to do that.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. The schedule of components, for example, for the swimming pools, is arrived at by two methods. One is you have an asset list which has a list of assets related to everything in the community, but we've pulled out those related to the swimming pools, which is good in one sense. It gives us a historic information because the asset list tells us that you spent money on this item in this year. And so we know what money you spent on it, and we know when you spent it. That's important because we need to know the history in order to project the future. So we have a lot of components here are from the asset list, and you'll see on this schedule there's an OPA asset list number. If a component is from that list, there will be, see if I can scroll down here faster, you'll see numbers associated with that, so you can find them on the most current asset list. Asset lists, unfortunately, it's really a misnomer. It's not a list of assets, it's a list of expenditures. It's what's called a general ledger of we spent money on this. It might be that they spent money on part of an asset replacement, or they might have spent money on 2 different assets, and that's in there in the asset list. So to round out and fully flesh out the study, we come on site and essentially look at all the facilities and identify components that we see that may not be identified specifically on the asset list. And for that reason, you will see a number of components that don't have an asset list number next to them. And they are components that we developed. There's 2 ways that we price these. And again, what we're looking at is creating a budget. So we're looking at what, let's say, what today in 2018 it would cost to replace this specific component. We're starting with what's called current dollars. What does it cost in 2018 to do that? Because we're looking ahead 30 years, we're going to apply an inflation rate to that, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And that will develop that will convert these present costs to what's called future costs, or future values of these costs. But we start with the present cost. We get that from 2 sources. The source we use, we have a cost estimator on our staff who has developed a cost database for us of many thousands of items. We update that database every year. And our costs, when we put in a cost from our sources, they are coded, and they're coded to that database. What that means is when we update our database and we open this study, let's say let's say next year, those costs will be translated to next year's costs. In other words, our codes will convert those costs to the current dollars for that year. Costs that are based on your asset list are handled in a similar way, but not through these codes, because we don't have codes set up for your costs. And I'm going to scroll across here, and I'm going to come back and explain this sheet, but scroll across. We get costs from your asset list, and what we do is we put in the cost that was spent on that item and the year that it was spent on, and then we apply an inflation rate to those costs to project them up to a current cost for 2018. So that's how we get from both sources to current costs. I'm going to also add, if I can quickly, reduce this scale a little bit so you can see this. We have a section I've just opened up in here called Cost History. When we are done with this process, we actually will provide this spreadsheet to management, to the association. And the association will have the ability, should they choose to do it, which can be a daunting task, to update any individual component when you actually replace it, okay? So if I have a component that was listed in 1999, and I have a cost for that, and you replace it in 2019, you can update that year to 2019, put in the actual cost and how it was quantified here, and the source of that information. That information will override our estimate and become the actual information for that component. So the goal of this tool is that over time, this will become an actual history of what's happening in the association, both from a cost side and from a useful life side. Because where we're projecting an estimated useful life for something, I may project a 15-year life. and you replaced it in 12 years, that's a learning tool for us. It didn't last 15 years here. We may use 12 years as the projection next time. Or we may find that there was a reason it didn't last 15 years that you're going to correct, and we can still use the 15-year projection. And the same is in reverse. We see a lot of times we go to a community and see a component that had a 20-year life, and we're in year 27, and they're still they're still making it work. Okay, fine, great, that's wonderful. We want to know that as well. Okay, so that's how this works. Now I'm going to come back here. I'm going to close that if I can. There we go. So the information that's in here, as I said, is a list of components, and by component we mean an actual replacement project for something in the community. We try to itemize this to the greatest degree possible because we want it to be complete in scope. We then have a location for each of the components listed. So if we have a pool resurfacing, well, you have several pools, so I may have the same component name, but it's going to show up in different locations. And these are organized starting with the Mumford Landing Pool, and let's go down here a ways, Yacht Club Pool, Swimming Racket Club, etc. So they're all listed in here by location. We then quantify things, and if this is a component that we have looked at on site and determined the cost for, we're going to quantify that component. In this case, this is exterior stucco area at the Swimming Racket Club pool. So there's a quantity of material there, and we're going to have a unit cost for the replacement of that, so many dollars per square foot, and then we're going to multiply that by the quantity and get the replacement cost. Where we have, in many cases, just one LS means lump sum, that's a cost we got from your asset list, and that's all we have is you spent this money on that component, okay? Over time, I hope to replace really anything on this asset list with measured components. That would be the goal over time. All right. I'm going to close the relevance. That doesn't really apply to you. All right. So we've identified what the component is, where it is, when it was put into service. Then we have the estimated useful life, which is a projection of when we expect it to be replaced, or a significant amount of money spent on that for a major repair, or a renovation, refurbishment, whatever it is. So we have an expected life, and they vary. They're all over the spectrum. We have two columns projecting that, and the reason for that is in a study like this, where we're looking at a 30-year period, some things will actually be replaced more than once in that 30-year period. And we wanted to separate our planning for that first replacement from the planning for subsequent replacements, again, because we may change the projection on the expected useful life for the next replacement. Or we may, and I'm not sure I can easily find an example here, but you'll see in this column where we list percent of replacement. And most typically that will be 100%, meaning that when we're replacing that component, we're replacing all of it. There are some components that we create an allowance for. For example, sidewalks. You're never going to replace all your sidewalks at one time, but there are going to be sections that will need to be replaced. So we're going to measure the entire quantity of sidewalks, and then we're going to create an allowance to have money towards partial replacement of those as needed. And it might be 5% replacement every 5 years. We'll look at something like that. Again, the goal of this is to provide a logic and a budget for doing that work. Excuse me. And those types of numbers can be adjusted over time as we see what you're actually spending and how often you're spending it. All right, so then continuing over, we have the replacement cost, which again, if it's a measured unit, will be a unit cost per square foot, per square yard, per linear foot, et cetera. And then an actual replacement cost. That's the expenditure side of this study, is projecting when things will be replaced, we expect them to be replaced, and how much we expect you to have to pay for that. That's gonna create a whole, again, over a 30-year schedule, it's gonna create a whole different set of costs every year going forward. Now, yes?
One quick thing just to point out, where we end up with all the zeros over there in replacement is where the board decided to expense anything under $5,000. So while we have it listed, it's not part of the reserve, and that is basically expense that year, and that went up from, I think, 1,000 to 5,000, which is, we still have it, we still have to pay for it when we replace it, but we're not reserving any money for it. So that was done by the board, and that's important to know how we got to the zeros at the end.
And all that means is that when the board replaces that item, they're gonna replace it out of the operating budget, which is your overall budget has two sides, an operating budget and a reserve budget. You're gonna pay for it one way or the other. The board has elected to not focus on small items in the reserve plan and just allow the operating budget to handle those. So we did keep them scheduled in here. I think eventually they would go away, but that's the reason for that. Yeah.
So I got a question too. Have we, at our one work session, we talked about the components, just putting in a lump number, or not including the numbers for the country club because of the situation?
Mike?
It's on, it's on. You gotta get close.
During our work sessions, we talked about, there's nothing in here for the country club. And one of the things we talked about was getting a lump number in there as opposed, we didn't think you'd be able to get the component part numbers in there. Has that been updated for today?
Yeah, we actually had, and that was I think, a learning curve between us and management. I had put lump sums in the review, we took those out, and then in a later review, I think probably following those questions, we put them back in to make sure that we did have a large enough budget to accommodate what the scope of the project was expected.
On a component basis or on a lump sum basis?
Well, it's a lump sum. It's an allowance based on previous expenditures for building that facility. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. I'm going to go to a part of the study that causes a lot of confusion, and I'll try to get through the confusion and then dismiss this part. As JB said, I'm actually, the term is reserve specialist, which is a professional designation by the Community Associations Institute, which is a professional organization that most communities belong to and a lot of management people belong to, and reserve providers belong to. And they have a set of minimum standards for reserve studies and things that they want to make sure the analyst conveys in the study. And a reserve specialist, one of the things we need to do is make sure we incorporate all of these pieces into the reserve study. One of those pieces is to advise the community of the health of their reserve account at the point in time that the study's done. And so we do what we call a historic funding analysis. In general terms, it's called component method funding. And component method funding is the way all reserve studies used to be done years back. I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, a bright guy introduced a different way to do this called the Cashflow Method. And that's the method we use actually in projecting your future needs here. Some analysts still use the component method, and some use both methods in their studies. We use the component method only to create a snapshot and give you that comment on the relative health of your reserve account at this point in time. What this method does essentially is, and you know, John, to answer your question at least on swimming pools. So on swimming pools we have about 360 components. Okay, I would guess for the whole community there might be 2,500 just in the general reserves. Okay, probably more actually. But let's say there's 360 components in the swimming pool. They all have different replacement costs. They all have different expected lives. We treat each component in this method, we treat each component as if it were its own reserve account. So if I had a component that costs $10,000 to replace and I want to replace it in 10 years, I should put $1,000 a year in and I'll have the money for that component when I need to replace it. That's the concept of the component method of funding. And so we do that little analysis here on each of these components. How old is it? How much money should you be putting toward it each year? How much should you have in the account right now? And then if it's underfunded, we look at the deficiency. We run through that and we come up with a total for that account of, well, you should have been putting in $340,000 towards swimming pools every year, and you should have about $3 million in that account right now. I'm going to switch over to the funding side. Get here. And we have this little page which has a thermometer on it, and you'll see it has these. So for the swimming pools, there was that $340,000 and there was that $3 million. We did that for we added up basically those needs for each of the groups, and it came up to a number that said essentially you should have been putting in $1.9 million per year. This is a let me because there'll be a lot of misinterpretation. This is a theoretical number. If you were theoretically funding these components at 100% by this method, you would be putting in $1,966,000 per year towards all of those components, and you would theoretically have a $19 million reserve account for general reserves right now. You have a $4.5 million reserve account, ergo you're 24% funded. That's what this is saying.
Doug?
Yes.
In general, the average for a large-scale HOA percentage would be what range?
Well, I would say it varies from 50 to 75%. And then I would say 70, by this method, people who use this method would say maybe you should be funding at 70 to 75% of full funding. They do that because they're trying to estimate how much money you'll actually need for your reserves. Most communities, if they fund at 100% by this method, will be overfunding, yes.
Yeah. You know, and JB, it was a good question. It was something I was hoping to just push it out a little more and get into more of the process before we get into something like that. It is where we want to be at, we do want to discuss that, and
Yeah.
at the end get your recommendation.
Yeah.
Let's just go through this process, the rest of what we want you to
Yeah.
go through, make recommendations before we jump on something like that, because that is, you know, the end game, all right? So let's not jump there, although it was great. I wanted to ask it myself, believe me.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask you to discount this method because there's a reason we don't use it for projections. And the basic reason is, for example, in the swimming pools, you don't have 360 separate reserve accounts. You have one reserve account. And in fact, you have one reserve account for all 25 or 3,500 components in this community. And it may be that if I took each of those separately, some of those may show higher on this scale than others. But essentially, anytime you spend money on one, you know, this is saying that, well, yeah, I should have this much money toward this component in this year. Anytime you spend money on any component in the reserve, and that cost varies at all from the cost in the study, and the time frame varies at all from the cost in the study, that affects the expected balance of every other component because these costs are pooled, okay? So that's why we don't use this method for projecting reserve needs. Is you have what's called a pooled account. You have, and this is what everyone has. You have one reserve account. And so what we want to look at is where we expect the expenditures to occur over a timeline in that account, and how do we fund to meet those expenditures. This is an arbitrary thing. It looks at long-term as well as short-term costs. There's different ways to get to your goal in each of those situations. And that's why we use the...
Just ask a question on that
Yeah.
quick, just right on point on that. So I understand you have the component, the historical versus the cash. The component has a process of doing the calculations for the replacement of the components. When we look at the cash method, does the calculation of the components kind of come into play to get
Yes.
that number?
Yeah. Both methods are dealing with each individual component and funding it. The cash flow method is a more logical way, and let me go right ahead to that right now. You'll remember I showed you, let me go back to it quickly. I showed you this in the, what am I trying to do here? Okay. I showed you these annual expenditures in the draft study. So we have a group of annual expenditures for each of these, what I'm calling expenditure accounts, each year. And in this master funding plan, they are here and they are grouped. And so we have different levels of expenditures for each reserve account expected in different years. And they're added up to a total estimated expenditure group for each group of components. Okay, so and that varies every year. It goes up and down. And we have a starting point. We have a funding. We know what your beginning year balance is now, which was $4.5 million, and we know what you're contributing right now, which is $1,677,000. And we also have one other piece of income into the reserve account every year. That account, that money is sitting in various bank accounts, maybe some CDs, et cetera. So you're earning interest on that money essentially every year. And that goes back into the reserve account. So that is also an income number from our standpoint. So we have your contribution and your interest income, and that makes a total income side of the account. So we're starting again with that starting balance. We're adding the income side, and then we're subtracting the expense side, and we get an end of year balance, which carries up to the following year and continues on for 30 years. This is shown a little more easily in this graph right here. And what this graph is showing is the end of year reserve account in each year, the different expenditures in the red bars each year. They go up and down. And so when you're spending more money, it's pulling the account balance down. When you're spending less money, the account balance grows. And it is a natural thing to expect this account to go up and down over time. As long as we have a plan and we know why it's doing that, you don't need to be worried about that. In fact, you should expect that. I sometimes get boards that are afraid to spend money on something because it's going to draw the account balance down. Well, that's the reason the account is there. It's a savings account. So as long as you have a plan for how to do that, then you can expect that, yes.
So Doug, and again, because we're on this slide, so this slide, this chart, how does that compare to the 26.1 and the number you showed us in the historical? Now, there is a difference here where I wouldn't see that number there, correct? So if you could just point that out, what are you showing us?
There is no relationship between that and this. What this chart is showing, and it is a chart that is a solution to the funding of the reserves here. What this chart is showing is that if we have done what I have done here, which is in every year of the 30 years, the reserve account balance is above this yellow line, which I'll talk about in a second. What we're doing is we are fully funding every component in this analysis over this 30-year period, and we are maintaining this account above a minimum dollar level. That's the goal of the study.
Go ahead, when you're finished.
Okay. The yellow line is what we call a threshold line. We could design this study to allow the reserve account to be drawn down to zero in the lowest year, essentially, and say, okay, we're going to spend all the money in this year, and then we're going to let it grow again. Because we know nothing happens exactly the way we're forecasting, we need to have a contingency in there, an allowance for things to happen that are unplanned. That's called the threshold, where we set a minimum balance for the account. It is an arbitrary number. It is a number that the community uses to feel comfortable that it is satisfactorily funding the reserves and has a cushion, a satisfactory cushion in the account. This board, not this board, the board a few years ago when we started this process voted on $1 million minimum balance, and that is there. The threshold line goes uphill over the 30 years because that is indexed to inflation. So we're letting that minimum buffer grow as the value of the dollar decreases essentially over time. I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to.
So Doug,
Yeah.
and you did answer my question, but this is really important here because you said discretionary. I just want to make sure everybody understands that if they're looking at this chart, how it does or doesn't compare to everything else you showed us in the calculations.
Yeah.
And does anybody at this table first have any questions on what Doug just went through? Because it's not difficult, but it could be something where somebody could misunderstand it. I just want to make sure everybody has it.
I would say that if you follow this method, and again, this is designed to be adjusted, that's why we call it a navigator, to adjust it every year, you will probably never see that component number get to 100%. It will probably be in the 50 to 70% range. That's okay. So, but it's really an I have a lot of people who ask me just not even to show that in the study, and that might be the request out of this.
As long as everybody understands.
Yeah. But we had a methodology just to say this is what things look like in the account at this point in time. So with that, I will say in our work, with that we discount it, but the only reason that I like to use it is it tells me one thing, and I'll go back to it quickly. It had that 1,000,009 there, and you are currently putting in 1,006,77. So it does suggest to me that the account is being funded slightly below where it should be annually right now. That's something I look at as a guide, and the cash flow study is going to either confirm that or not confirm that. In this case, it's confirming it. So let me do something here. First of all, we have put in a anticipated inflation rate or a projected inflation rate of 2.49%. That is an average of the inflation over the last 10 years. And the specific inflation index that we're looking at is developed by there's several companies that estimate construction costs and that actually track construction costs annually. One of them is R.S. Means Company. They have been doing this for 80 years, and so they have an index of how construction costs have increased over every year, over the 80-year period. So by their methodology, over the last 10 years, the inflation rate in construction has been 2.49% on an average.
And Doug, before you go on from there, and again, this is an important point, that's a construction inflation number, not the CPI.
Not the CPI.
Right, and that's, yeah, people need to understand.
Because that's essentially what your expenditures are going to be relating to is construction costs in 99% of the, 90% of the cases. Is that type, they'll be experiencing that type of inflation. Okay. So we have put in that rate, and what that means is that all of these costs out here have been converted from the current dollar cost that I had stated in the initial schedule of components have been converted to future dollars. Okay, so that's what these red bars, and you see these red bars are getting bigger over at this end of the graph. And that's what's happening. Now I'm going to just take this down.
It's pretty neat.
Here's the 1,006,77 that you're contributing right now. We're looking at that number. We're looking at the fact that there's going to be inflation. And what that's saying is if you didn't increase your contribution over time, you'll stay above zero for 10 years, and then the account will go in the red, essentially, go below zero, okay? Now that's, aside from the fact of whether the account is well-funded or not well-funded, the reality is inflation eats the money, and you have to keep up with it, just as we all do in our own lives every day. We have to respond to inflation. Things are going to cost more in the future. So that's why we have this little trigger here, where I can increase the contribution incrementally by a percentage every year. In most situations, this is an appropriate way to fund a reserve account, meaning you're going to incrementally increase the contribution to reserves every year. The reason for that is I could say I don't want to increase the contribution every year. I want to pick a number and stay at that number. If I did that, the number I picked in 2019 would be a lot higher than the number in 2018. But it also means that people today are going to be funding that with their dollars at the same rate as the same dollars as somebody 20 or 30 years from now whose dollars are worth a lot less. Okay? So it's natural to increase this incrementally so that the relative cost and impact on people is the same today as it is in 2040 because their dollars are worth less. Okay? So that's a large reason why we do this. The fact that we are saying it's a little underfunded shows up in the fact that against that 2.49 inflation rate, we're recommending that the contribution be increased at 3.5%. And that increase or that difference is how we're handling that underfunding, the present condition. And what it's saying is that's all it takes is less than 1% higher than the inflation rate to resolve those questions and those issues, to fully fund all these components when they need to be funded. Now, I'm going to show you a table called the assessment allocation table. And this includes one other item. We're going to talk about bulkheads in a minute, but the bulkhead reserve account actually has two components. Well, component's not a good word. It has two funding parts to it. One is contributions, assessments that are paid by owners who have bulkhead walls along their property in one fashion or another. But there are also common area bulkheads, and the entire membership pays a contribution to the bulkhead account for the common area bulkheads. So what we did is we took the portion of the contribution that is in that, and we added that to this assessment allocation. So what we have is in the graph that I just showed you, which is this one, we have some projected contribution numbers. And for the first 5 years, they're right here. I then have incorporated the same group as a general contribution from the bulkhead account in here. I've then put in your operating budget and to get to the total assessment. That is the general assessment for reserves in the community. Now, the importance of this is that while these reserve account contributions may increase at a different rate from the general account, they are not a major part of your overall account. These two account for just under 23% of your overall assessment, your general assessment, okay? So if these are so when I say that the general reserves we have to increase at 3.5%, that's fine, but that's only impacting that portion of the overall account. Now in this model, what we're doing is you'll see that the operating budget is increasing also. And again, this is a projection. I'm not dictating anything to the board. You folks set your operating budget. But the reality is, because there is inflation, all budgets go up over time. Okay? All costs go up over time. So in this assessment allocation, we have looked at assuming that the operating budget over time would go up at the inflation rate. Now, I just want to emphasize, this is just a planning tool, all right? And so what it's saying is that the one thing you will see is if these are increasing at a little bit higher rate, then their percentage of the budget will increase slightly over time. But it also says that in this projection, given inflation, that the annual increase in assessment might be, in this model, 2.7+% against a 2.5% inflation rate. That's not bad. That's just slightly above, 0.2% above the inflation rate. We then, and I know that the actual cost for people varies, but we just break this down to by the total number of lots on a cost per year. There's the total cost per year and cost per month, just to look at how this model shows those increases occurring. Again, this is a planning tool for the board to look at as you're developing your budgets. That's how this account works. The bulkheads and the roads account work in a similar fashion, but I'll be happy to take questions on this account right now.
On page 13, if you page 13.
And I don't have page numbers here, but tell me what you're looking at. What kind? This is
Assessment allocations,
and this is different from your book.
Yes.
maybe slightly different.
It's considerably different because I had not put the bulkheads in
Yes.
there when I did that, number one.
Okay.
And number two, we, when we issued that draft, we were projecting, I think, a 3% increase per year in the
Right.
reserve contribution.
Right.
I'm now projecting a 3.5%.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
So there are differences there.
Then I'll just ask the question, year over year per lot, on the general reserve piece, not the bulkhead piece, year over year on just a general reserve contribution amount. What you had given us was around a 6 or 7. I'm sorry, what we had was a $6 or $7 increase per year per lot. And I was wondering, do you have that number?
Well, one of the things, per year,
Per year over year per year per lot.
yeah, this is a 51 to 77 is a $16 per year, looks like. One of the questions that I think is a reasonable question and something that perhaps ought to be done is we have both of these, as I said, both types of bulkheads, the common area bulkheads and the individually owned bulkheads in the same bulkhead account. We can pull the common area bulkheads out and put them in this account directly so you can see that expenditure here if you want to. But the point is they're both of those, the common contribution to bulkheads is included in your total budget, so I wanted to reflect that in this schedule. Okay. I'll be happy to go on to the bulkhead schedule, unless people are just totally, I don't know what to do with this.
No, it's fine. Does anybody have a question so far on this part or the calculation?
Okay.
Okay, it just,
Bulkheads, Don?
well, yeah, let me just, before we get to bulkheads, just on this, on the numbers are changing. As I mentioned before, we're still vetting out the detail that goes into the calculation on the assets. So some of these numbers may change a little bit, but this is for today as far as the process, okay? Actually, we have, yeah, okay, let me take the table first.
You were earlier highlighting the...
Use the mic, please.
You were highlighting earlier the construction cost index,
Yes.
which is a variable on an annual basis. You also talked about inflation factor, the interest income. Ideally, if we invest our reserves properly and based on a current interest environment, one would expect for us to basically almost break even and create almost a wash between the inflation factor and the interest income derived from the reserve fund. So when you did your variables, when you plugged in different numbers, what the incremental reserve increase should be, how would that be affected if we actually are improving our return on our cash? Because right now what I see here plugged in was 1.5%, which is pretty low ball from a planning management point of view.
I'll give you a point, and then I do want to talk from BNF to answer that, but
Okay.
please go first.
I see a wide range of earnings on income on reserve accounts. Some smaller communities don't invest their money at all, so they're earning 0.25% on a money market account. Some communities, and I would think this community would be large enough, can work with an investment planner and make the best investments they can. The one thing about investments in reserves is you are really required to be conservative on that and have items with guaranteed returns. So you don't play the stock market with your reserve account. You don't buy, well, you can buy municipal bonds and things like that, CDs, things that are going to have a predictable and guaranteed return. I will tell you that in my experience, and I'm not a CPA or anything like that, I rarely see the earnings match the inflation. They follow. If the inflation goes up, the earnings are going to go up. I am happy to, and what I use, I think we got the 1.5% from what an average, an aggregate of what you're earning now. As you've seen in this model, we can change anything immediately. So let's play that game. Let's go 0.025, 2.5%. Well, that's how that impacted that. That just changed that. If you were earning 2.5%, that would mean, well, it didn't help us that much. It took us down 0.1%. Okay.
That's it.
Yeah. Again, because your earnings, I'll show you what's happening here. If I have a new community and they don't have any real reserve expenditures for a number of years, let's say out 25 years, what's happening is they're going to be building this large reserve of money, a large volume of money in their reserve account. They can invest that and they can earn a lot of money on that money. You have a lot going on all the time, and so you're never really that far ahead in your account, okay? So you're investing essentially against the total cost of the reserves. You're investing a smaller amount of money every year. And obviously you have to limit your investments so that you have enough money in the account that is liquid that you can get to when you need it.
Right.
So I'm happy to put in whatever number you folks tell me, that's how that works. So I'm going to put this back for where we are.
So just, right, and Doug, that was great. It's basically what BNF was going to say. Our investments are conservative in nature. That's our investment guidelines. They're not going to keep up with inflation, definitely not construction inflation. The second piece that I see as far as a function of this is how much we agree upon or is decided to be in reserves to begin with. So to me, it would be a function of those two items. But just in general, overall, we're going to be conservative. That's what our investment guidelines say. So it'll help. We can do better than we have, and we're working towards that.
And we can come back, and there's certainly one nationwide discussion right now is what's going to happen with inflation. So I expect it will go up, and we can, as we see what happens, we can project a different value there and see what happens
Doug,
there.
one more thing, and I guess that everyone else attending, is that this study is what we're looking at today, but it's also the recommendation that we update this, review it every 3 to 5 years so that we can make the adjustments as we move forward. If we have too much, if we think we have too much in reserve or too little in reserve, we can make those adjustments as we go.
Right. There's two types of updates. One is what I'll call just a financial update. You can do that as often as you want. We have a lot of clients who do it every year. And that's really where you're just coming back and looking at the reserve account and looking at the changes that have occurred at year end, what you spent money on, and updating all of the component lists for that. But it also gives us that opportunity to look at your investment income and the inflation rate, and we can update the entire model as often as you want to. That's just called a financial update. The other type of update is what's called a level, we call it a level 2 update, which is an update with a site visit where we come back and look at all the components again and assess their condition and reevaluate our estimates. Obviously, where you have, for example, the country club, you're gonna, in a couple of years, you're gonna have just in a lot of aspects, a different facility than you have now, and we should come back and look at what is that now? What is that facility? So those are reasons to come back and do an on-site analysis, essentially. Okay. Do you want me to go to the bulkheads account? Yes.
So let me just orderly fashion. I think I had Pete first, then Frank, and then Joe.
No, I just, bulkheads.
Oh, when you get the bulkheads, Frank?
Can you go back to your slide where you showed that for about the next 10 years, we're in kind of a good zone?
The Navigator
Yeah.
bar graph.
This is the Navigator, yeah.
The other slide, which showed us quickly over 10 years going away from where we should be.
When it was
When it
sort
started-
of flipped.
When the green bars start going far south.
Inverted curve.
Oh, if you don't increase the contribution?
Right.
Okay, that's on this slide. I just
Okay.
adjust it. I'll just take the increase out. Okay.
I just want to make sure that from the process I understand this. So the 1.6 million contributed today looks good basically out for the next 10 years?
It stays above zero. It's below this threshold. So it's below that $1 million, drops below the $1 million in year 8, and it drops below 0 in year 11.
Again, the $1 million was a
Threshold, a goal.
I'm just asking about the tool itself. So,
Yes.
one of the, I believe, subdivisions here has a policy of when the house is sold, people make an initial contribution to a capital account. It's part. If that was adopted by the master HOA, by Ocean Pines in general, is this tool capable of capturing that and showing what effect that would have on that the minimum line?
Yeah, we have some communities that do that, and how that would show up is, we just have some things in our model that have different things, words people don't like to see, like special assessments. But we could add a line item for that projection, for the projected income from that activity. Obviously, that's hard to project, because we don't know how many houses are going to sell, what they're going to sell for, and how much income. Well, it won't matter how much they sell for, but it's a matter of how many houses sell per year. Over time, you're going to get a pretty good idea of how that's happening.
Right. But not as a policy, but as a possibility for tracking. That would be one way to kind of keep that minimum line where it is without increasing the assessment. Your tool's capable of tracking.
We can track that, yes, we do it.
all right, so I had Joe, and then I have Marty, and then you had bulkhead. Joe.
Regarding that last comment, I'm not so sure if that would even be allowed under our declaration of restrictions. But aside from that, if I understand this correctly, and perhaps I didn't, just to use round numbers, if we have approximately 5 million now, the number was 19,520, we're talking about 75%. That would say to me that if we were where the gentleman says we perhaps should be at 75% today, we would need to take another $10 million today from association members. Is that correct?
No, I'm not saying that. That's why I do this projection, to say that you don't need to do that.
Yeah, and
That's why we discount that other method.
What's the 19 million represent?
It's a theoretical number of if you were, if God was shining his light on you and all things were equal and you were flush with money and you had $19 million account, I would say you were 100% funded. I rarely see that.
75% funded, which would be about 15 million.
Yeah, I'm just saying,
I don't know what you're saying, but that's.
What
I'm
was said
saying,
is that,
I'm saying you should ignore that component
yeah,
method.
ignore that,
That's right. No, wait, no.
ignore that.
It's somewhere in between.
Ignore the 75%.
That's why we go through this process, is to show you where those expenditures are and how we're gonna meet that.
I got Marty and then this gentleman. Marty.
It probably should have been removed, but it's still in there, and it keeps raising its ugly head. Ocean Pines has no avenue for special assessment.
Right.
Correct.
None.
Yeah, that's just part of our spreadsheet model, and what I will do is,
It's skated under the script.
there you go.
It's gone.
It's gone. It's out. Sorry, your name?
Dick Neiman, just one question. In accounting, we always have depreciation, and obviously the things that you're throwing through operating, you wouldn't be doing that with. I don't know what percent that represents of your total here. But if you have depreciation, and you have a reserve for depreciation, the only thing I know that it doesn't include is an annual increase cost of living. So I look at all this detail and I'm beginning to think this is more like an economist, okay? I'm trying to figure out, is this just to try to prove what you've known? I mean, depreciation says 20 years life, 1/20, 5% a year.
All right.
If you took 5% and added whatever the inflation rate is, how does this service better?
The problem with that is depreciation in your asset list is an accountant's terminology that they do for a tax basis. Doesn't mean that the reserve component will last that long or that the life will be that short. So we use a different basis for projecting the life of components, and we're dealing with the actual replacement cost versus a depreciated cost. So, we're trying to deal with what we expect will really happen over time, and obviously then we take that actual cost and add inflation to it.
So it's a difference in the depreciation rate, basically, the life of the assets.
Yeah.
Is that what you're
Yes,
telling me? Okay.
yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So I think, Pete?
No
I'll pass you the mic.
Some people say, don't ever give Pete the mic.
I agree.
Just responding to Dick's comment / question a moment ago about depreciation. First of all, it's not just a tax concept. Depreciation is an accounting concept to account for expensing an asset over the life of that asset. Has nothing to do necessarily with taxes. We're a not-for-profit organization. There are thousands. Anyway, it's not just tax related.
I'm not an accountant, so I
Well,
will give you
okay.
my.
It's a method of recognizing the cost over time an asset instead of in the year of expenditure, period. Okay? As to depreciation, Dick, the historic method here in Ocean Pines for funding the reserve has been funded depreciation. Ever since we had the reserve account established some 40-some years ago, the policy has been to fund depreciation. That has been, of course, based on the historic cost of the asset. So if you had a $10,000 asset, lasted 10 years, you'd fund it $1,000 a year. However, at the end of 10 years, it doesn't cost $10,000 anymore. It costs $15,000. Over time, Ocean Pines got itself in rather a pickle because of this concept and inflation. Now, obviously, we've got low periods of inflation now compared to what it had been. Some of us remember the Carter years. But in any event, what happened was, over time, this concept of funding the depreciation did not have an inflation factor in it. So consequently, when this building was constructed, it cost $1.75 million on a low-scale budget. I think Marty would agree. Marty was very much involved in that, and we did it 1.75, not $5 million, right? The cost of this building on the books, which we'd fully depreciated and set aside money for, was $363,000. That's all we had set aside for this building based on depreciating 100% of the cost of the original building. So over time, every asset that we had. Now, wisely, administratively, before I was involved, they began to provide for an inflation factor. So it was depreciation as calculated on every single asset, plus an inflation factor, modest, of some, and but it affected the assessment. Were it not for that inflation factor, the reserve fund would have gone negative about 10 years ago. Okay. We had the 5-year funding plan, which raised dues, $26 for the reserve fund a year, per year, and then cap it after 5 years and keep going. We have $4.5 million in reserves now, basically?
That's what it says. Yeah.
Okay. $7 million of that came from the 5-year funding plan. Raise it each year over 5 years and then continue, I think 8, 9 years. Anyway, I'll end there and say that we would be negative now in our reserve fund were it not for that $7 million.
Okay.
Well, bulkheads.
Oh,
You're gonna get the bulkheads later, right?
Yeah, let him do it. Give him the mic, let him do the bulkhead, but thank you for the background on that.
Okay. You want me to go to bulkheads?
Yeah, all right, so bulkheads.
Remain, Mr. Chairman. Go back to the navigator page.
Okay.
Okay,
For the general reserve.
there we are.
All right. There were a few decision points that we've had out there for a couple of months now. Are we satisfied with the construction inflation rate at 2.9, the average of the last 10 years, or do you want to change that? And this is an example.
Right.
The finance committee, budget finance committee will make those decisions later on.
Exactly, okay.
But I want you to be able to see.
This
or
is
if you
only an
wanna put
example that
something else
JB
in
wants
there,
to show
let's see
you.
what that does to those numbers and those bar charts.
Okay, it's only an example that JB wants to show. Go ahead.
Okay.
One on the bulkhead.
Hmm?
One on the bulkhead.
Yes.
All right.
Come on. All right, the bulkhead reserve study, the difference here is where the general reserves had, we established expenditure accounts and had several groups of spreadsheets. Everything in this study is in one set of spreadsheets. So the bulkhead component list is here by address, by lot number, by section, and by the date that the bulkhead was last replaced. And this is a long component list, obviously. And I think at the bottom are these general property bulkhead components are down there at the bottom. So all these are in this bulkhead account right now. And we have a projected life for these, and we have a projected replacement cost, a unit replacement cost for these. This information has come from Public Works, from what the expected, and I think it's been massaged a little bit from planning, but essentially we're relying on your information of what you're actual spending to replace bulkheads to build our cost picture for that. So like any other account, like any other reserve account, this projects, let me get that out of here, different bulkheads being replaced in different years. And this creates some long cost schedules here, expenditure schedules. Some of them get very long. And it varies again, so that some years we expect more money and some years we expect less money. Although it appears that this is running in the $1 million range here. Between $1 million and $2 million, a couple times a little less going on there. So if I look at this in terms of that funding plan, you can see, yeah, the bulkhead expenditures they vary every year. And we have a couple of larger differences there. But that's the expenditure picture for bulkheads over time. And we have, and so we've gone through the same process in the cash flow to look at what does it take to fund that. And in this case, in terms of establishing a threshold, the board hadn't voted on anything. We use a approach, a recommended approach of saying we're going to look at the total expenditures on this account over the 30-year period and take a percentage of that and let that be the threshold. In this case, we're using 4% of the total expenditures. This is kind of the same way that a capital construction project in a city or something, when they're projecting funds for that project, they're going to look at the hard cost of the project, and then they're going to put a contingency in, which will be a percentage of that cost. It might be 5 to 10%, depending on the comfort level with the planning cost for the project. So we're using 4% here of your total expenditures over this account and establishing the floor there, which again is about $1 million in this account for a threshold. And then we're solving this. So I'm putting in the same inflation rate. I am putting in, well, we have the same earnings rate, okay? Because it is, again, all your funds are being, I might say, and tell me if I'm wrong, but while we break these into certain accounts, the actual funds are broken out differently. They're all invested in different things, so they don't break down by account necessarily.
They're commingled.
They're commingled, there you go. Okay, so if I took the current contribution, let me back up here, which is 663, actually let me, we did a couple things here. Okay. That actual budget, trying to blow this up. That actual contribution budget is the budget for the owners who have bulkheads.
Right.
We then put in the $160,000 for this coming year into this account for the common area bulkheads. Okay, so we have those two funding sources here. And then, of course, we have three funding sources because we have the interest income or investment income coming back into that account as well. So with those three pieces of income and then the varying expenditure rate in every year, that's what's producing this graph. And again, if I took it down to no increase, I can't, I'll say that's the reason I can't do this is because we're actually putting in a higher amount starting in next year. So,
so 160,588 is that $19 that everybody pays. That
yes.
we didn't do
That
this
we
year.
took out of the budget.
Right, that's why it's not.
That we
in
took
that.
out this year because there was no spend.
Right, that's why
for the
it's
last
out of
2
column
years.
C there.
right. So I can't quite do, well, I can do that because I still have the other funding stream in there.
Okay.
So if I take this down to a 0% increase, and I go back and look at my cash flow schedule, I'm still increasing, I'm still starting with this and increasing this at a rate, which is the common contribution for the common area bulkheads. But the owner's bulkheads, I have taken down to 0 increase. And so you can see what's happening to that account, given inflation and the funding needs of the account.
Right.
And so to solve that particular account, it took us up to, I think it was 4.6% increase per year.
So, JB, Doug, it's definitely a robust tool that's as good as the information we put in it, right? The detail was scrubbed. Obviously, there's some decision points as came out. So going forward over the next week or so, I see how Doug's making the changes. Is that something your team, JB, can do, or we reach out to Doug if we want to see the effect of any decision or that we're looking at over the next week?
I don't give you, meaning JB, the software. So to do this calculation, you folks need to work with me. We do that in an online meeting. So we have a meeting, he's in his office and I'm in mine.
Perfect.
We can do it.
It's fine. It's definitely a robust tool. Okay. Okay.
As a matter of observation, the biggest bar for expenditures, and just as a matter of observation, is almost exclusively on the common area bulkheads in that particular year,
Okay.
not the homeowner.
Yeah.
One of the things that we need to decide, Mr. Group, is, question that came up, showed it a little bit earlier, was the general bulkhead, the common property bulkheads, and the private property bulkheads. Do we want to take the common property bulkheads and put them into the general reserve, and so that the bulkhead reserve just has the private property bulkheads in it? Because it could be easier to follow the accounting, if you would, of,
Easier, which way?
well, if the amount of money that's going into the bulkhead reserve, if the
Yeah, I got it.
common properties were into the general reserve,
Right.
then the bulkhead reserve is just dealing with that extra amount of funding level
Right.
for the private property bulkheads.
Right.
Just a conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
You may not want to do that, but
Yeah, I
that's
got
been
it.
a conversation.
Right.
Of the
So
committee.
that point has been brought up. BNF is not prepared today to give a decision, as you're saying.
Right.
There's a lot to that. I just want to make sure that all the detail and the numbers, that everybody on the BNF team understands it before they render something on that.
This is also one of those that's important based on what we're actually doing, because we're doing work down on Wood Dock and some other areas that still have 9 years left by this, but we're doing emergency work down there now. So this is where we need to keep up with.
Yeah, you folks need to update that.
Exactly, need to update it, because that's going to change a little bit
Yeah.
of when it occurs versus
Right.
that.
Another point that's been brought up is, you know, we were talking about the minimum threshold earlier with the general reserve. Both the bulkhead reserve and the road reserve have that same threshold amount escalating each year as well. Do we need, and this is a rhetorical question for debate and decision at some point in time, that is, in the bulkhead reserve, do we need $1 million in that threshold, or should that be some other lower number?
Just as a matter of information, on average, the last 10 years, the bulkhead ending balance of the bulkhead reserve has been around,
Use my,
sorry, just as a matter of analysis, the ending balance of the bulkhead reserve over the last 10 years, if you average those numbers out, is about a little over $500,000.
so that may mean you might want to lower the threshold for the bulkhead reserve, not the other ones necessarily, but the bulkhead reserve to that $500,000 number.
Right.
Conversely, the 10-year average of the ending balance of the general reserve taken from the audited financial statements is a little over $3 million, and we're using $1 million threshold. Just a matter of.
So those points, JB, will be on the list. We know we have to, I can't solve it today, but they're excellent points. Okay. We have a question? I think he was first.
Yeah, again, on the bulkhead reserve, I hear what Gene's saying, but I think if I see it right now, there's about 3 years worth of money in there, in the reserve. I'm not exactly sure how it's factored into this presentation. But if we need them, it was $800,000 a year, it was $400,000 a year. I understand it goes up. Well, let's just say, using hard figure of $1 million a year right now, do we need 3 years worth of reserve in there? As a property owner on a bulkhead, I calculate out you got about $1,000 worth of my money that on a pay-as-you-go basis, which we've done for like 50 years. I'm trying to figure out why I need to have banked $3 million to cover one. So I would appreciate some kind of consideration or some feedback as to why we would need 3 years worth of money in that reserve at this point in time. Now, all of a sudden,
Can I address that, John?
I prefer not to in this meeting. Point well taken. It'll be in there. You'll be able to address it in the work session and coming out, but point well, I got the point. Again, I want to take the points. I don't want to solve everything today, because there's no way I'll get to the, you know, the mission for today's meeting. I just have one here, and then, yep. Did you have a question? Okay, right there's good. Go ahead. Oh, you can come here if you want. Yeah, yeah.
Don't get too close. Don't get too close.
I don't know, I might stop giving this to you, I don't know.
Take it away easier. Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Bulkhead. Chief Massey still here? Thanks. I may need some police protection. There's a fact that is probably not well known. Some people at the table know it, most do not. I have spoken to this to prior boards. It was an issue that came up at the B&F committee some years ago. As a result of the issue is splitting JB, as you suggested, we might want to do, you might want to do, between the owners and the association. And that question was raised several years back. Gene Ringsdorf, I think, was one of the people that raised that at the B&F committee level, right? So I did an analysis of that, going back to the inception of the Bulkhead Reserve, including all the expenditures and the revenue. And here's the bottom line. The allocation methodology used for purposes of the budget is 80-20. So the public bears 20% of the cost, and the private owners bear 80% of the cost. The linear footage, however, of the bulkheads themselves is not 80-20. It's 92-8. Right, Gene? Right.
All right.
Yes.
Pete, Gene.
Okay, so
Hold on,
that's it.
Pete.
That's the fact. That's all I want to say.
Okay.
That has to be taken into account by the Budget and Finance Committee and the board.
It'll be in the work session. Definitely will reach out to you and Gene on that. It's important. For today, we're just identifying the points. It's excellent history. I definitely reach out to the two of you in the work session, okay? All right, so let's get back. I think I had another question. No? Yeah. Oh, the question was there. Let's keep it on the points. We're not trying to solve everything today.
It's really more of a comment as you go forward, Budget and Finance Committee, and finalize the work here. One thing that I observed is you're using a same construction inflation rate for the general reserve and for the bulkhead. So it's probably the same for the roads. You're using the same percentage. Obviously, the general reserve fund construction inflation rate, there's a bunch of different products, labor involvements. But for bulkheads and roads, I think it's single labor, single kind of a product. So it's much easier to have a more accurate construction inflation rate for those two reserve funds because they are, pretty clearly what those are. So I would expect perhaps a slightly different inflation rate possibly to be applied towards bulkheads and road reserves for that very reason, as opposed to standard across. I can see it across general reserve fund because of the multiple components and labor involved. But for bulkheads and roads, I would venture to say it possibly could and should be different. So just food for thought.
Okay. So
Can I comment on that?
Oh,
for a second?
absolutely.
The kinds of costs, and I understand, I appreciate that. Certainly from a historical perspective, you can pin that down. You know what it is because you would have the history of it. These types of costs, though, both for roads and for the bulkheads, in that general inflation rate, those are typical construction activities and material costs that are part of that, are part of construction. So they go into that establishment of that rate. I have from time to time had boards ask me, can we use a different rate for every different thing that's in there, And the one that's always picked out is asphalt, okay? It was picked out, a few years ago. It was, and we used to get, I've talked to payers and they say, well, I can give you the cost today, but I'm not gonna guarantee it tomorrow, okay? To some degree, from a planning standpoint, that was a lot of BS. Because they were worried about it. It was asphalt was going up at 20% a year. Well, where is it now? It went down, okay? Now it's coming back up again. But over time, that impacts the overall construction inflation rate, and it is factored into that. Bulkheads, there's a cost of steel. Is it steel that you're using now, or what are you, whatever the material is, there's a cost for that material, and that's impacted by construction inflation. And in the short term, it is possible that construction inflation, I would say in the next 3 to 5 years, may spike. Because there's such, we're in a full economy. Costs, all the factors are in place for construction costs to spike because there's a high demand. It may, after that, dip. We don't know.
So your recommendation would be basically to use the same rate across all.
Yeah,
all
I'm
funds.
happy, and the reason we set this up this way is I'm happy to use a rate that you want to use,
Right.
but I'm going to give you my advice on that.
Right.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks.
yeah, that's good. So we're at 10:30. We have another half an hour. I do want to get back to somewhere like pages 5 to 7 where you talked about the 26% and where we're at after you're finished with your
Okay.
piece. But I would want to touch on that kind of at a high level so everybody gets a feel and they understand that these numbers still aren't finalized. We're still scrubbing detail. How much more do you have on your end as far as the presentation?
I would close this and go to the roads.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. The roads, like the bulkheads, has a long list of components, not as long as the bulkhead list, but essentially there's a component line for, we do have the main roads, which is Ocean Parkway and a couple other roads, and Ocean Parkway is broken down into sections. And then we have the 4 bridges that you own, which have been recently replaced, and then the other 2 are the incoming and outgoing lanes at the entrance to the community. And then after that is all of the neighborhood roads, and so they go on down as such. Ocean Pines has you contract with someone to come and evaluate the roads every year, and our projections are based on evaluations. When we did this in 2015, I had an engineer come and look at the roads, and he pretty much agreed with the evaluation that OPA had, consultant had recommended. So we're basically using their evaluation and doing projected useful lives for repaving roads on that basis. And that comes to this graph. Actually, I'm gonna move, well, I'll let you look at this graph for a minute. You can see that we have, in this case, we've established a 5% threshold, and that's our starting point for recommending thresholds. We can go up and down from there. But that's where that line is at the moment, and you'll see there are a number of years below that line. The interesting thing about the roads is that you are a community with private roads, and historically, as a community, you have not funded the private roads. You have relied on funds from outside sources. You get money from the state through the taxes on the casino, and so we have a line item for casino funding for the roads. And you also get some other income from the state. And I think this other income line was not in the draft we sent you because I didn't know that at the time. But there is another county road income that comes to Ocean Pines. So we have put those 2 funding sources in there. Now, I'm going to, let's see, 34. And currently, you're not putting any money in as a community. I'm going to continue that so that the only funding for the roads comes from the casino and the county. And I will admit, in this particular model, those are not being increased at the inflation rate. because we don't know, I don't know the basis on which those are increased, so they're just shown at the current rate. But what that says, very simply, is that's not enough money to maintain the roads. Okay? So our task here was to come up with some recommendation, and the number I started with was 350,000. And that is a minimal number that keeps this account in the next few years above zero, but not above the threshold. And I could move that number higher, or I could increase it at a high, right now I'm increasing that at the inflation rate. The problem is that the shortfall here is near term, and incremental increases is not gonna solve that. It's more of a step increase in the contribution that would solve that. Now, that all comes down to how you wanna maintain the roads, essentially, and whether you wanna create a funding line for that or not. I can solve this. That's gonna be the slow road to China.
If I may, just for a second regarding roads, how many miles of roads do we have? 84. What's the average cost per mile, not from original construction, but to mill and pave, or just resurface? You're looking what, 400,000 a mile, minimum?
Probably, yeah.
All right, use that number, $400,000 a mile minimum, times 84 miles. And we're not we have $375,000 basically a year. That's how many years to cover 84 miles? A lot. A lot longer than the road's going.
It's more than my lifetime.
So if we just keep doing what we've been doing, we won't be touching roads, no matter where they are in the list of years, whether it's the North Gate bridges, whether it's all the regular roads of the communities. It doesn't matter where they are in the lineup of things. We don't have enough money going into the road reserve to accomplish that.
I agree.
And the general question is, you know, we plugged in 350,000, you know, that's a huge jump from zero.
No,
but the point is to educate everybody that there's not enough money there to do it.
So I actually was gonna ask if somebody could just, in a minute or less, just tell us why we've been at this situation in a minute or less.
The county used to fund a lot more than this a year to us, and I think Marty would know. State, was it 400,000?
Liquid fuels tax.
Pass through from the state, right.
Yeah.
Now they bought roads with that.
Ally redirected the money from the counties, away from the counties.
Yeah, so we moved from getting about 400 or so a year, is that right? 500 a year to zero.
And we stopped funding depreciation for roads.
Correct.
Now.
We never did it.
Well, all right, but we're putting nothing in, really, is what's happening.
Every year there's a number in our budget, depreciation roads, and every year the board ignores it.
Okay, and then the second thing is that this does not include any line items for culverts underneath roads and/or within the easement that would be the Ocean Pines responsibility. So every driveway that has a culvert in it that's within the easement technically would be an Ocean Pines responsibility if it had to be replaced. I don't know, that question I have out there, but certainly the culverts that cross the streets are ours, and we're not putting anything away for that, so that has to come out of operating, correct?
Right. The road reserve definition, if you would, does allow funding for those things to be included in it, but right now it doesn't include any of that funding.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. We have it on our list, BNF.
What's the lifetime of the road, projected lifetime if you pay for it?
We are looking at a 25-year life typically, between 20 and 25. Some shorter, depending, again, it was depending on the condition.
20 to 25-year life, then with 84 miles of road, we need to be doing about 4 miles of road a year. And that's not gonna happen on $375,000.
That's 1.6 million.
If we add depreciation, we're getting better, but that puts us a little over $500,000, and we really need almost $1 million.
Need 1.6.
Right.
Okay, that's the point. It will be addressed.
Okay,
Okay.
that's all I've got.
We need a better data on the roads, just not to leave everybody with the idea that we have 84 miles of roads to be replaced. You know, there's U.S. Department of Transportation, there are
Right.
studies, there are tables that
Right.
show the road expectancy for major highway versus secondary
Right.
roads or local
And-
roads. Goes from 25 years to
Right.
50 years life expectancy. So let's not,
Right,
you
and
know,
that,
create
it's well done when we,
fear
in the work
factor.
session, we'll welcome all comments on that when we have the work session on it, but I agree. Marty. Marty.
I hear from Mr. Green that we have some engineering on our roads. I've asked and raised that engineering on our roads now for months. If that exists, I'd expect it by the middle of next week.
We have an engineering report, did I hear that? Yeah. Can we get that, please? Yes. Okay,
Okay.
how we doing, Doug?
That's all I've got.
That was good. Okay, so that's pretty much Doug's presentation. I think maybe a few minutes, maybe 2 minutes, just going back on that 26% and that 70, whatever. Just an explanation on it, because it is something that,
It's 24 in this
all right,
particular.
all right, that's fine.
That number has gone down.
That's
what,
fine.
2%
Again, this is just
since you plugged in
examples
Country
right
Club?
now, it's not final.
Actually, it
It's a
was
ballpark.
the country club, and we did have a miscalculation on some of the other costs that didn't inflate them, so we fixed both of those. Okay.
So, basically, does anybody in the audience have any questions on that, or did they understand everything Doug went through? Because this is, comes into a decision point for B&F over the next X amount of days. Joe?
Given the answer to my prior question about the 20 million versus our current roughly 5, it sounds to me like the ultimate answer to whatever we're discussing between 50% funding, 75% funding, boils down to one final word, 2 words, political issue. This board has to make a political decision on how much money it wants to take from association members for reserve, that's it.
Doug, I just want to, and then jump in.
Go ahead.
And that number did not include the roads that we just talked about?
Correct.
In the, okay,
Yeah,
so I
this
just
is-
want to make
that's a
sure you
separate
heard,
account.
you understood
Did
that.
not include the road?
No, sir, it did not include the roads.
This calculation does not include the roads,
Right.
because that's a separate account.
Right, okay, so I just wanted you to have that,
Or, it does not include the private bulkheads, which is also a separate account.
right.
I don't see it as a political decision, because it's a different method of calculating a need, and we don't consider this to be a reliable method for projecting the need. So let's say, let me do this. Let me throw some money in this account. What do we want to put in, 17 million? See if I can get it right.
John, we're not gonna use this.
Do we have enough zeros?
Why are we?
That's the way my bank account
There's
works.
17 million.
He's gonna walk ahead with 75% of it.
Well, there we are.
That's what I want to, if you want to say that, say it.
Yeah.
So you could put in 17 million and not increase it. You'll see, this is where that comes in. Long-term, that doesn't fund it if you didn't increase it.
I'm gonna.
But you could
just
put
let
that
me
in
introduce you.
and say, okay, now we're fully funded, and so we're still gonna have to increase it a little bit to offset inflation. And to assume that really if this is going down, it's probably gonna be set higher here because it's gonna continue to go down. But, so let's go ahead and just put this at the inflation rate.
So, okay, I'm gonna.
So if I have 17 million and I increase that at the inflation rate, I'm keeping a pretty good account balance out here of 20 million every year going forward. If I turn around and take it out, the bottom line, the impact of not having that 17 million is that I have to increase this at 3.5% or 3.5% a year instead of 2.5% a year. So that 17 million accounts for a 1% difference in your funding increase annually. Period. That's not political, that's just numbers.
Do you understand that, Josh?
Yes. But what I'd like to do is, that was the mechanical, that was the financial side. I'd like to ask somebody from the board, since this became political, and I'm not saying it shouldn't, and I understand where you're from, because I'm on that end. Somebody from the board to respond to that?
Go ahead.
Well, first off, as you said, we're not using the percentage funding as we go forward. We're going to use a threshold and a 5-year cash flow need. So we're not going to say, hey, we've got to be at 75%. Right. So everybody should be clear on that. Based on what we're talking about here is setting that threshold so that we protect ourselves in the event that there are sudden, unknown things that occur, and then looking at what our cash flow needs are, determining what we're going to use as a rate of inflation, and determining what we're going to use as a cost of construction there to make sure we keep that cash flow in line with what the needs are. So that, I would agree with you completely. I'd throw that stupid sheet away on any future ones you do, because it confuses the issue here, really, for Ocean Pines, where we are at 50 years. And that's great if we're just starting where you are funding 100%, but it's very difficult at this point to go from 4 million to 17 million. It's just not going to happen. So threshold, inflation rate, contribution increase rate, that's how we get there with the 5-year increments.
One final question, if I might. The average association member doesn't want to look at all this. What they want to know is, if you decide to follow this approach, what is the assessment going to increase? What amount is going to have to be added to the assessment in order to meet whatever goals are setting? That's what they want to know.
And as soon as it comes, the recommendation comes back from Budget and Finance, we'll be able to plug it in and say it. But I just don't want people to get.
We don't have a guess yet?
No.
It's not 75%.
It won't be funded at 75%.
It's not 75%. That's why I wanted him to go back. I didn't want somebody walking out with the 75%
Again, I would say that that whole percent terminology is based on the concept of component method funding, which is not the concept we're using. So by this graph, my response to that is, this is a 100% funding plan by the cash flow method, meaning everything that's projected to be spent on in 30 years is being spent, and you have at least $1 million or more in the account in the worst year.
That's the ending balance.
And that's at 1% increase a year?
No, this is at 3.5% increase in the reserve contribution. In our model, it's about a 2.75% increase in the assessment in our model.
Okay, did somebody else have a question in the back that I missed? Sir?
Doug, thanks for being here. At the conclusion of the process, does the association receive those Excel spreadsheets so internally we can update forecasts on?
We don't give the association the software. We give you the
software, meaning the Excel spreadsheets.
Well, we give you the spreadsheet. We give you is that schedule, or I should say, those schedules of components. So that's not it.
The component list can be updated.
The component list.
By us.
The schedule that's already prepared that shows each component, date of expected.
You will get that in Excel. You will get that in Excel.
Yes, that spreadsheet.
So you can update the input information to this study.
We already have it.
We do.
I got it right in front of us.
Well, you don't have it in Excel, but you will have it in Excel.
Model.
In a program.
Who's this? The Excel spreadsheet.
Sir, can I just, before,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you, sir, could you identify yourself and name, please?
Don Butt, I'm been a property owner in
Property
Ocean
owner.
Pines for 10 years.
So you want to be able to go in?
Well, I'm just thinking about that $1 million threshold we talked about. It seems to me there is a basis behind that. It's primarily driven by creating a cushion for unexpected changes in the cost of construction, and perhaps unexpected refurbishment needs because
Right.
of an extra hard winter.
Right.
Something like that. So I think there is a basis behind the million. So if I'm the board and I'm trying to establish a foundation on why $1 million seems reasonable, I'd want to play with my spreadsheet saying, suppose inflation ends up averaging 4.5% instead of 3%, what does that 1.5 point spread do to my unusual need? And I create a cushion for that in my threshold. I want the association to have the ability to do that modeling on the fly.
And they do, but they do it with me, essentially. That's how we do that.
So do they get the Excel spreadsheets?
No. Only one spreadsheet, which is the schedule of components. Everything else that we're doing here, we would sit down and do together.
But the schedule of components, if I remember that slide, doesn't that have what the cost is, inflation, all that's built into that slide?
Well, the inflation factor is actually built into the other half of the study, which is in this slide here. Those get fed from this. The inflation factor in those component lists gets fed from this.
So will the association have the ability to do modeling
No.
on its own?
No, not by themselves.
Okay.
That's. But it's, as you've seen me do it here, like put in 17 million, take it out, it's easy to do. We do that in a meeting,
Right.
we do it in an online meeting.
So JB, and I think you're gonna answer it, what would you have to answer his question?
The spreadsheets, all those components and their associated costs for, going all the way out to that far right-hand side of the spreadsheets. That's what we will have. We could update those, and then we would send that information to DMA, and they would upload it into this program.
So we maintain just a list of components?
Correct. But, and that's when, I was coming to this later, I'll reiterate it. We'll go through, the reserve study has this set of list of items for 2019 and 20. When we get to the budget time, which is coming up, the department heads and I, we will look at those items and, okay, do we really need to do those in this year? That truck's got another couple of years left on it, so we'll push that out. There may be some other things though that were out in 2025, well, we gotta do that now. Okay, so that comes back up. And then that process, that item, we forward those changes to Doug and he reloads them into the greater calculation. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so any other questions? Are we done, or one more question? Two more questions? Right, you said right there.
The $1 million threshold, Doug, at the very outset, you described that as some previous, I don't know whether you said management or board established that threshold at $1 million.
Yeah, that's my recollection, is we were asked to use that, because we usually use a
Are you
percentage.
talking about the general manager?
Yes, I will say Ocean Pines. I can't tell you
Okay,
who
because I was
initiated
involved
it.
in the discussions, as you know that, okay?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's a huge difference here. That was for purpose, the board there's been no policy decision made as to a $1 million threshold. It was an exercise that was performed back then for this purpose. But at that time, the focus was not on the cash flow method. It was on what Ted just referred to as the Smith, and it sounds like a consensus is, we're not gonna use the component method. But remember, the component method is where we were the last time you did the study, 2.5 years, correct?
We never did the study by the component method.
Back to your point, picking a percentage, 40%, 70%, that was all based on component, right? That line there was meaningless because at that time, that $1 million was really arbitrary and only for purposes of this exercise, but the focus was away from the cash flow method at that time and on the component method. And so 2 years ago, there was a session with the board, Tom, you were there, that focused on 40%, 50%, remember that? Had nothing to do with the $1 million. You probably never heard the $1 million, did you? No. So you're presenting that today as though that has been established as precedent by some previous group, either board, management, whatever. It wasn't that wasn't the case at all.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Okay. No, it's a good point, and again, more work session than like meeting today, but I'm glad we heard it.
And that $1 million represents only 5%.
I understand, and I'm glad you pointed it out, but again, it's good.
Actually, if I hadn't used that number, the number I would be using, the default method we start at is 5%. So it probably would have come out to the same number.
Again, it was more for example. Okay, Marty had a question. Yeah, Marty. Marty, you're in.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dave, I didn't see you back there. I'm sorry.
I just want to know about moving forward. In our discussion earlier this week, we talked about the fact that there are significant components, let me put it this way, that are not properly accounted for. And when we know that, for example, I got a little bit of a different impression today, but for example, the top floor of the
Right.
that is not included.
It is now.
It is now.
Okay.
That was updated.
It's not in the book that I have right now.
It's been updated.
Okay.
Correct, that's been updated.
Okay,
Right.
so that's been updated.
Yes, sir.
We don't have it. And was it put in for 2018 or 2019?
For this.
There's
current
like
year.
$1.6 million for 2018, I believe,
Yeah, for this year.
for the current budget year.
Okay. Any- There were other areas that, I mean, are going to have to be considered by the board, it's already been discussed. The admin building is one, expansion of the police department and so forth. I'm talking about some fairly significant near term, next, few years, 5 years, projects. And,
Dave, I'm sorry, but there is a list. There is a list that JB and his team are working on to address the items that you're bringing up. We had it in a work session. He actually sent out a draft last night. I believe I gave a copy to Marty. So we are addressing your questions. Yeah, and that's why I was just looking at Marty. It's on the fly. It's happening as we speak. But for today's meeting,
So my question is really, and you partly, what's the process for doing that? And what's
yeah, you want to jump in?
Well, I think one of the things you were mentioning, Mr. Stevens, was everything that's in the reserve study that's over $50,000, Doug was going back and highlighting. But we didn't print out new sheets and everything yet, but all that will be highlighted, so they'll be easily more identifiable, everything over 50K. There is regarding the admin building, there is $50,000 in this year's budget for architectural and engineering services. There's been no action taken on that project yet, including any conversations by the Budget and Finance Committee or the Board of Directors to deal with the admin building yet. So all the focus has been obviously on the country club. And as we were just saying, the 1.6, I think that was added, there were two component list line items that totaled, I forget what it was before, but after you adjusted it.
I had put some numbers in, and then we took them out when we did the draft. We've put them back in.
Right. Ideally, in a reserve study, you don't have, okay, say like this community center, you're not gonna put in 1.5 million for replacing the building. You're gonna have it broken down to all the components of that facility. Well, evidently, historically speaking, we didn't do that with the country club or a lot of our facilities that would go way back.
Actually, we did the components in the country club, but then they were all, half of them, like the mechanical components, half of them, most of them didn't work. And they said, well, you're not gonna replace them, you're gonna do a different design. So we just threw them out and we put in an allowance.
Right.
Can I ask, you're going to do that same thing with the 1.3 or whatever it is, the upstairs of the country club? I mean, basically, you have to put in the money that you're going to plan to spend and take out the money that was in the component list.
We took out the components that we knew you were not gonna replace, and we have put in an allowance for this major construction.
Okay, Marty, you had a question, or was it the same?
It's sort of more, yes.
Oh,
You can feel a little bit of the concern in the room, or I can.
Go ahead.
Over this driving up assessments.
Hold on.
Here's my question. what is the assessment amount year one for reserves? I mean, I've got 1,745,800. Is that about right?
Sounds about right.
That's your total 17 million.
Sounds about right. Again, these numbers are changing
I
on
had
the fly.
1,677,000 plus that 160, so 1,677,000 is what we were given.
Right.
I'm close.
So,
Now let's add to that, just for fun, 500,000 for roads. Okay?
okay,
We're up to 2,250,000.
okay,
Okay? That's 600 less than the average we put in the reserves the last 5 years.
Good.
So it's not driving our assessments.
So I think Joe goes home a little easier tonight.
It might actually be lowering our reserve.
Yeah.
It is lowering our reserve contribution.
Yeah.
So
Well, all right, hold on.
Is that the message today?
I'm not gonna say.
I don't see any reason not to
All
say
right,
it.
well, you're gonna, no, that's fine, that's fine. Just like I felt we had to say that it's not gonna go up 75% or whatever. That's fine, that's back of envelope today, that's fine. I don't have a problem with what you just said at all. I'm glad you said it. Pete?
This will be my last.
Thank you.
Doug,
Talking about. That's an average. That's
Doug.
really average, yes.
yeah, we have said, you have said disregard the component method pretty much, right?
Yes.
People aren't using it anymore and da-da-da. But you also said at the beginning of this meeting, you took a snapshot, and it's an important snapshot, is it not?
Yes.
And you said to measure the relative health of your reserve account at a point in time. The relative health.
Well, let's say
Those are your words.
the relative funding,
I'm just using your words.
Yeah, sure.
Let me read you something. It's from one of your clients' other reports with respect to this component method. And I'm not objecting to using cash flow. I'm just saying it is a way of measuring the relative health of an organization. Are you 20% funded of where you ought to be? Are you 50% funded? Or are you 5% funded? But here's what you said, and I'll quote. The fairness theory of funding requires that all owners, whether recent or long-term owners, should pay their fair share for the replacement and repair of their capital assets. The theory is based on the premise that the owners have enjoyed the use of assets for the period of time that they have lived in the community, and therefore should have contributed their fair share in proportion to the time that they have lived in the community. The closer the association is to 100% funding level, the better off it is, because this indicates that the owners have been paying their fair share during the previous years. Any percentage below the 100% funding level indicates that the owners have not been paying their fair share during the previous years. Any percentage over the 100% funding level indicates that the owners have been paying more than their fair share during the previous years. That's a quote from one of your prior reports describing the component methods.
Another 15 million.
You haven't been paying.
I don't recall that quote, but I'd like to see it where it came from. I don't necessily disagree with it in concept, but I don't recall it.
You're not disagreeing in concept.
I don't disagree in concept.
But that doesn't mean you need to be at 100%, of course.
Well, and again, the exercise I went through to put
I'm only
17
4
million
minutes
in, yeah, it makes a difference, but it was, over time, it's not that big of a difference.
It just puts in perspective what we're
Yeah.
trying
Yep,
to achieve
no,
here is
point
fairness
taken.
over time for everybody, right?
Point taken. With that, I'm looking at the time. We had plenty of time for questions, comments from the audience, as well as from the table. Next item on the agenda is review of action items and next steps.
Yeah. Briefly, the Budget and Finance Committee will be meeting to talk about these concepts that we've talked about today. Construction rate of inflation, what percentage you want to use there. Do we want to change anything about the minimum threshold for each of the 3 accounts? And what ultimately factors into that navigator sheet for each one of the reserves. Then after the Budget and Finance Committee does that, they will forward those recommendations to the Board of Directors. And then the Board of Directors will adopt those. So whether or not, for example, if there was nothing about $1 million threshold in prior years, the Budget and Finance Committee and the Board of Directors of Ocean Pond Association will either set that or not set that.
Right.
And then we get that information all back to DMA, and they produce a final reserve study piece.
Right, I agree with all that. Gene, you had a question?
For our meeting coming up to consider all this and make our recommendations, we'll need the updated copies of this, will we not?
Yeah.
And will we have them in time for next week? I guess you're talking about next week meeting?
It's this week. It's this, the week coming up.
The week coming up.
Yeah.
They're all, we just need to get copies of it.
Except to republish it, yes.
Yeah.
And
Six
JB,
will be
right,
designed.
a lot of the questions that Dave had and Marty had, I know you had answers already, and that was gonna be to update the asset list.
So we'll be provided with that.
Yeah, you'll provide it. When is your meeting?
Well, it depends on how much was gonna be involved here today and everything, but it's gonna be over the next couple of days. Outside of the weekend.
Yeah.
Somewhere between the beginning and the middle of this coming week.
It'll be, Doug, as far as practicality of implementation, of updating everything and sending it back out to us.
Can you get it to us by Tuesday?
Yeah. Yes.
All right, hopefully it's raining on Wednesday, so we can work on it. Okay. There's a question there, quick?
Yes, I'm here to thank everybody on the board member for, what great job you guys did with the pools, and the palm tree, I think, was a little touching. Thank you so much. But, my name is Stephen Curtis, and, I live on the south side, and I just, it's needed. I mean, you gotta be competitive. I want it to look beautiful, you know. You guys did an excellent job on the pools and everything else. So I just wanna thank you guys for working hard, and the recent decisions, we're done too.
Okay. Okay, as far as, JB, you good?
Yes, sir.
Okay, then as far as from my perspective in BNF, as we mentioned, as soon as we get back the updated schedule, that will encompass all the questions that came out of BNF, the work sessions, as well as the individuals that also gave us, we will review. There's several decision points or recommendations that we have to make, and we will do that. So hopefully it'll be this week, unless we come into some type of situation, but I doubt it. Outside of that, BNF will be pondering everything that was brought forth today, so we'll ponder over the next 3 or 4 days. I'm done. Okay?
We're adjourned?
We are adjourned.
Doug adjourns.
I move
Move for adjournment, back.
Second.
Oh, man,
Oh, my God.
Talk about, you said, you know, it's better than 100% method, yeah.